do Congresso Dialectics of Violence and Extimacies of Politics, com essa mesa composta pelo professor Vladimir Safatle, que o professor Vladimir Safatle é professor da filosofia da USP, psicanalista e exímio pianista, e vai fazer um concerto, lançar um livro amanhã, né, Vladimir? Se quiser mostrar o livro, para quem não vier aqui, vá ao SESC e convide os amigos.
Criticism to a fundamental sector of social criticism. There were two dimensions of this Frankfurtian understanding of cultural criticism. First, it was a matter of insisting that capitalist promise of socio-economic integration could not be realized without process of psychocultural integration. Adherence to mechanisms of psychic subjection present in the most elementary products of the film industry, the music industry, among many others. This may explain why Adorno speaks of the cultural industry as a reverse psychoanalysis. And this fundamental dimension of the critique of culture was something that we can find in authors of the first generation of the Frankfurt School, such as Benjamin, Marcuse, Krakauer, and also Adorno. But the passage with which I began says something else, because it points to the understanding of art as a sector of a praxis of social transformation. And this is the other dimension of cultural criticism, to which I would like to draw your attention. If the establishment is scandalized by the liberated form, it is because it has an inductive force in other fields of social practice. The liberated form is not an individual production. It is the expression of the violence suffered by imagination, from the potentialities not yet realized, from the virtualities not yet actualized of social life. By recomposing sensibility from such a liberation, the aesthetic form decouples the subject from the subjection linked to the labor society and its modes of psychic reproduction. It's not for another reason that Adorno will insist, and I quote, the grossness of thought is the incapacity to operate differentiations within the things. And differentiation is as much an aesthetic category as a category of knowledge. In other words, contrary to a general trend of the 20th century aesthetic thought, Adorno does not cease to analyze works of art from criteria of truth and falsity and false, authenticity and inauthenticity. And this allows him to relativize the autonomy of social spheres, of values, and to claim that artistic activity provides us with coordinates for thinking about moral action and cognitive expectations. Claims. Contrary to Kant, from whom intersubjective agreement on beauty would require no reference to rational truth or moral norm, Adorno never ceased to insist that identical force act on non-identical spheres. And I insist on this point to remind how there is a phenomenon in contemporary critical theory that we could call a aesthetic deficit. A deficit linked to the loss of critical force of critical theory, linked to its, let's say, domestication. It is not only about the totally secondary and subsidiary place that considerations about artistic production play in recent projects linked to the Frankfurt School tradition. It is also about insisting on what we could call the loss of tension between normative claims of social life and the disruptive force of aesthetic experience. This loss of tension implies erasing the fact that art is a social praxis that preserves transformations that social life no longer knows how to put into operation. In this sense, the secondary character that aesthetic experience plays in hegemonic sectors of current critical theory is an expression of the decomposition of a fundamental articulation in the Frankfurtian interdisciplinary program. A decomposition that is only the other side of a domestication of criticism, of a retraction of the horizon of transformation. Since theory no longer sees itself as an offensive force against the normative limitations of our current political horizon, since it has abandoned its association with revolutionary process, there is no longer any reason to seek to scandalize the establishment with the recomposition of the systems of relations promised by the liberated aesthetic form. But someone might object my way of reading the role of aesthetic experience in the first generation of the Frankfurt School, especially having Adorno's in mind. For one could say that aesthetic experience is, for Adorno, the name of a form of social collapse. Let us remember, for example, his canonical utterance. I quote the first phrase of aesthetic theory. It has become self-evident that nothing referring to art is self-evident anymore, neither in itself nor in its relation to the world, not even in its right to exist. But I would like to draw your attention to some aspects of this formulation. When it was written in the late 60s of the 20th century, it resonates with a certain historical situation that was being felt in more integrated societies of capitalist development. We were in a time when the discourse of social integration through the interventionist dynamics of state capitalism still asserted its hegemony. Even if such integration in operation in the so-called welfare state was paid by the preservation of colonial relations, by the underdevelopment of countries of the so-called third world, by the massive resource of the spoliation of a sub-proletariat composed by immigrants. The process of social and psychological integration, even with that, the process of social and psychological integration to the normative horizon of capitalism found ways to sustain itself. However, for a moment, in this historical context, political struggles seemed to move outside, let's say, the administrative regulation of social conflicts, creating a sequence of structural revolts within these highly integrated societies. While the so-called third world countries continued their anti-colonial struggles and their attempts to get out of the unequal stabilization of underdevelopment. In other words, when it's said to have become self-evident that nothing relating to art was self-evident anymore, the political social horizon was far from seeming closer to possibilities of structural and revolutionary transformations. Political struggles indicated the irreducibility of effective social contradictions. And this was not only a description of the social-political horizon of this time. The very field of aesthetic production seemed animated by experience in the process of the experience that deepened their critical capacity and their formal elaboration, whether in cinema, in movies, in visual arts, in literature, in theater, and in music. But perhaps we should remember that the historical moment in which Adorno seized on the structural insecurity of everything related to art was the moment of full production of Pierre Boulez, Luciano Berio, Georg Ligeti, John Cage, Morton Feldman, Stockhausen, but also John Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Astor Piazzolla, among many others. Adorno knew very well the potentialities of the musical production of his time. And around the same time he wrote this statement, about the same time that he wrote this statement, we have he also was committed with a manifesto called Vers une musique informelle, in which he defended what he understood to be a field of potentialities immanent to the musical production of his time. Well, it might then seem somewhat contradictory and perhaps even extemporaneous to state at that very moment that even art's right to exist was not self-evident. But I would insist that the diagnosis in question did not point exactly to a current state of the works, but to a necessary strategy within their compositional and creative procedures. To exist in this historical moment, the works of art had to be very close to their own disappearance. They had to build themselves out of their own impossibility, to feel the imminent risk of their mutinous, to fight against the internal tendencies of their materials. The strategy pointed to the problems resulting from the consolidation of the process of psychic and libidinal integration that would prove to be one of the most solid bases of capitalism. This integration took place preferentially not through the systems of material reproduction of institutions such as the family, religious practice, schools, or hospitals. All these systems were submitted to a macro system that colonized the others, giving them its rhythm, its narrative structures, organized its intensities, its limits, its persons, its confidence, its visibility. For there would be no social integration to capitalism without the psychic integration produced by a junction in full rise between culture and industrial production. A junction that received a familiar nickname in cultural industry, and that would become more compact and cohesive with the passing of time. This integration could endure, as indeed it did, even after the desolidarization with the economic promise that capitalists had once led us to believe. And against this, the only thing for art to do was to move to the edge of its own impossibility, using every possible strategy to remind us that we lack language, providing the figure of discomfort with language, in the hope of making this discomfort the force of emergence of another sensibility, able to break down the dynamics of psychic integration. For in order for emancipation to effectively take place, a certain form of psychic disintegration would be necessary, which is felt every time we perceive that we lack language, or rather, that the current language with its guarantees of order, place, and hierarchy exile us. Well, as you see, it's possible to read Adorno's aporias concerning the aesthetic experience in contemporary as a strategy and not as a diagnosis, as Albrecht Werner does, for example. The aporetic nature of art is the mark of its effective political commitment, of its tensions with other fields of social praxis. But it's a fact that many people today would see this aestheticization of antagonism as something else, namely as a decline of a specific aesthetic experience. This one linked to an autonomy that would have finally collapsed. An autonomy that would only be a purified vision of art, proper to a certain elitism that disdained to carry specific social functions, haunted by the understanding of aesthetic experience as an expression of genius, heroic and virile search for the sublime, as if it were a matter of showing the ideological commitment of a certain aesthetic exceptionalism. It was Arne de Grove that used this word. with its Faustic figure of creative genius that suspends order as a sovereign that would have the power to decree states of exception. In other words, it would be the case of saying goodbye to this aesthetic experience, to this social mystification, in favor of a more collaborative art that is no longer concerned with distinguishing itself from popular cultures through the originality of its language. Art that can be apprehended by everyone, thus being a more democratic and less hierarchical experience. Against a certain abstraction presented in these strategies of aesthetic autonomy, one should find forms of a healthy and democratic activity. Well, this perspective is based on the denunciation of the terrorism immanent to every attempt to produce a structural metamorphosis, a global deposition of such grammar. However, it forgets that the laudatory affirmation of the liberating potentials of new collective shares ignore that the affirmation of a liberated intersubjectivity in a coercive social horizon, such as our own, tends to produce the illusion that emancipation potentials would be supposedly already present in the current forms of life. And in the sense to remove from works of art the moment of awareness of their incommunicability is to involuntarily reiterate the mutilated communication that predominates today. It is to make artistic production a case of current modes of cooperation and co-working. Well, this perhaps allows us to better address a topos constantly mobilized in contemporary aesthetic debates regarding the possibility that we are actually facing a mutation of our artistic production towards regimes more adapted to a democratic life. For it would be the case to remember how the discussions about the possible readaptation of artistic production to the frameworks of democratic life has in fact the age of Kant's critique of judgment. At least if we follow a line of reading that seems to start with Hannah Arendt and her understanding of the articulation between aesthetics and politics from the emergence of a common sense that is a community sense, a sensus communis. Kant will speak of a gemeinschaftlichen Sinnes. In this sense, the aesthetic experience would be something like the prolegomena for all possible coexistence to diversity, thanks to the emergence of a common sense that would allow, as quote Kant, to judge a priori the communicability of feelings that are attached to a given representation without the mediation of a concept, thus realizing the expectations of universal communication and generic recognition. Judgments of taste would not be content to be solipsistic. They would express the desire to be communicated and shared. When we judge as a member of a community, be it actual or potential, which would lead us to defend that taste is a judgment linked to the possibility of communicating our feelings to the other, thus defending a certain cosmopolitanism, with consequence at the same time aesthetic and political. In the sense, it's not without interest to realize that many of those who currently defend the sunset of aesthetic autonomy engage in this path because they want to preserve the democratic potential of common sense, as if it were the case of freeing art from its belief in the irreducibility of its own language, in order to recover its potential for reconciliation with ordinary experience and its systems of forms. For this reason, one must remember how the universality that your work of art aspires to should not be articulated to some pretended generic translability in a field indexed by the existence of a common sense. It would be better to see in it the figure of excess in relation to the immanent process of determination of socially shared meaning. To take into account such assets requires a mode of relation that is not only relation to otherness, but something more structural, namely relation to what presents itself as an event that unpacks the limits of common sense. It's not by chance that the foundation of one of the central axes of the production of aesthetic experience in the last 200 years will not be exactly the sensus communis, but what is senseless. Senseless because it is established in relation to madness, which not by chance will be considered by Kant as a sensus privatus, as a paradoxal private language. And it's not only about remembering subjective experience articulated between creation and madness, but there is also to remember the process of creation that are deliberately built against the communicational guarantees of common sense. Okay. It would be better to take into account such excess instead of advocating some possible forms of counter-hegemonic use of common sense, as if it were possible to transform it through actions such as these that aims to, and I quote Chantal Mouffe, make visible what the dominant consensus tend to obscure and obliterate, giving voice to all those silenced within the structure of the existing hegemony. As politically engaged as such perspectives may seem, they make the same mistakes as leftist populist strategies in Poland. Namely, to compose force toward hegemony, but ultimately encounter paralysis. A paralysis that is never thematized from the contradiction immanent to the populist chains of equivalence themselves. For it would be the case to ask about the risk of counter-hegemonic practices that need to operate with the presupposition of a common sense within which antagonism will unfold. For there is a requirement, at least when we are talking about the aesthetic field, a requirement of a certain restriction of the domain of struggle, since it's a matter of struggling within a presupposed grammar, to deviate its element, to wreck its procedures, to redefine its agents. Such operations, as much as they have their interest and value, need to assume a limit. For it would be interesting to ask what counter-hegemonic practice need to preserve in order to organize antagonism in the form of counter-hegemony. What they should not touch and what they should not question. How much counter-hegemony is dependent of the preservation of hegemony? Or if you want, how much does such preservation not imply movement in a first moment and paralysis in a second moment? Exactly as we have seen exhaustively in the populist political practices of the left, especially here in Latin America. For it would be the case to remember that far from being a free faculty, imagination is a faculty disciplined in its way of organizing sensible experience. Such nature of imagination was explored in a paradigmatic way by Heidegger in his critique of Kant's intuitionism. Starting from such criticism, we can complement it by insisting that the violence of aesthetic experience against imagination, produced by deliberated form, will be violence against the social-political limitations implied in the very schematizing exercise of imagination, and against what the alleged transcendentally of common sense seeks to hide. At this point, it's not possible to follow authors like Christopher Mencken when they say that the free play of imagination does not follow any law. Decades ago, Adorno and Horkheimer had already insisted that the first service provided by the cultural industry to the consumer was precisely schematism. And I quote both, the function with Kant's schematism is to assign to the subject, namely, to refer beforehand the sensible multiplicity to the fundamental concepts is taken over from the subject by the cultural industry. Schematism is the first service rendered by it to the consumer. It is the schematism of the imagination that the cultural industry takes from the subject. It is his imagination that is expropriated. Expropriation that is only possible because such schematism has always been a social product. This was a way to criticize the ignorance of the socially regulated character of imagination and the social structures of communication that common sense allows. This explains how the increasing incommunicability of ecstatic experience will be the major expression of a more consequential political decision than the generalization of counter-hegemonic practice to the artist's field. For aesthetic experience, there will be no other alternative but to collapse the grammar of ordinary language, to prevent it from naming anything, so that another field of experience will be possible. Art will show that, okay, sorry for quoting, but the phrase is very nice, Hochschule. Art will show that, I said Hochschule, Caesar is also master of grammar. That the exercise of power is based on the elaboration of the syntactic conditions of social life, on the imposition of a grammar that will regulate the meaning of actions, the horizon of problems, the configuration of solutions, the structure of the subjects, the urgency of decisions. Every desire for uncommunicability in existence, in expression that art seems to mobilize in a more and more insistent way since the end of the 18th century, points to the questioning of such a grammatical domain. What Carl Schmitt said about politics is valid for the aesthetic experience, and I quote, "When it comes to decisive political concepts, it matters precisely who interprets, defines, and applies them. Who, through the concrete decision, says what peace, disarmament, intervention, public order, and security are. One of the most important manifestations of the legal and spiritual life of humanity in general is the fact that those who possess true power is able to determine the content of concepts and words. Caesar dominus et supra grammatica. Caesar is also master of grammar." I don't know if I have more time. Yeah, I have just one page. One must remember this in our historical moment, in which nothing concerning art is self-evident anymore. Perhaps art's lack of evidence is linked to another lack of evidence, this one concerning the possibility of structural transformation in social life. From the moment art associated its destiny with the emergence of pressure for social ruptures, it seems to have sealed its fate in a horizon of apparent revolutionary retraction, such as the one we know today, where even the force that should be the most disposed to rupture accommodate themselves to the horizons of adjustments in capitalist society. Even when these adjustments are sold as forms of aesthetic of intervention. What Walter Benjamin once said about works of art, that despite their rupture content preserved the techniques and modes of circulation proper to the established field of socially legitimized communication. This is still valid today, and I quote Benjamin. "The bourgeois apparatus of production and publication can assimilate a surprising number of revolutionary themes and even propagate them without seriously endangering its own existence and the existence of the classes that control it." And I promise that I finish. In the sense, it would never be too much to insist of how the field of communication does not unfold in some public sphere, but is completely colonized by the monopolistic structure of the cultural industry, by its figures, its styles, its visibility, its ways of narrating, its specularization. It's a matter of not forgetting that the organization of the forms of circulation necessarily define the scope of the meanings. However, some people prefer to make us believe that concepts such as cultural industry would simply be obsolete due to its inability to account for the active dimensions of the process of reception, with its irreducible and creative dispersion, and to deal with the irresistible democratization of production and access. Others will sustain an alleged dependence on a for-this horizon of production, as Paulo, unable to take into account how our post-for-this reality would open potential space for the recovery of the living labor, and comes close to what a virtuoso does. For the cultural industry would always open space for the informal, the unprogrammed, for creative improvisation. However, an adequate way to address the problem should pass through certain materialistic strategies. The first of them reminds us how an analysis of the political economy of media shows that the oligopolistic nature described from the late 40s of the last century has only deepened through the creation of large transnational multimedia conglomerates in which converge control of the media, of the production of cultural products, and of technological research in new media. In other words, this so-called democratization, which also seems to be the transformation of passive receivers into content producers, seems to accommodate an increasing concentration, to accommodate itself to an increasing concentration of media ownership. Multiple content producers accommodate themselves to the monopolistic nature of the media. We should start our analysis from this point. The so-called immaterial capitalism has not ceased to be monopolistic capitalism. It is necessary to say this because such a monopolistic nature necessarily implies a certain instantaneization and stereotyping of production. The media organize the modes of reception. Thinking about this stereotyping of reception, Adorno and Carneiro will even state that the public's attitude would already be part of the system. Well, this phrase must be understood in its effective context. Far beyond the mistaken figure of a catatonic consumers, what is in fact at stake here is the understanding of the way subjects must act like as if within social life, staging their own behaviors in a generalization of symptoms of duplicated consciousness. In this way, another very peculiar form of aestheticization of existence is consolidated, but without the potential for emancipation that was once deposited in this process. A form in which the social, as well as the spheres of what had previously been described as private life, are immediately confirmed as codifiable experience within the system of narratives of place and images proper to the industrialization of culture. In this context, the I becomes the name of a mode of insertion in experience integrates to the capitalist system of production. And we should insist that such integration currently takes place through experience, since the decomposition of the distinction between public and private spheres has brought about a new problem, namely the tendency to transform the former private sphere into a space immediately organized from the strategic possibility of monetization and codification, due to its perfect fit with the process of material reproduction of the public sphere. In this way, the fall of the distinction between art and life, an avant-garde utopian expectation, ended up occurring today, but in its own way, without the emancipatory realization it once promised. For it occurred as the integration of the frontier of the private sphere into the valorization dynamics of capital. Let's say the private sphere became the new space of the plus value extraction. The technophilia of certain sectors of social critics seems by abandoning a theory of relative surplus value extraction through the capitalization of what until then was devoid of value production capacity, namely private life, and its universe of immediate relations. In this context, it would be necessary to insist that anticipation of the reconciled society is an attack against reconciliation. It would be necessary to insist on such a statement against those who believe that the circulation of difference can coexist without at least the dramatic self-awareness of its contradictions. There where the disaffected generalization of the management of culture, of the creative economy, and of its persons that organize themselves as brand marks reigns. This would be the result of the critic of the aesthetic deficit of current critical theory. It makes explicit the belief in forced reconciliations that only reiterate the current inability of sectors of critical thought to consistently explore the link between the domesticated critical thought and its the undomesticated critical thought and its fidelity to the most irreconcilable dimensions of aesthetic experience within capitalist society. Thank you.
Obrigada, Vladimir. Agora eu passo a palavra para o professor Peter-Erwin, que vai fazer a sua palestra, então, também mais meia hora, sobre Dialectics of Marcuse's Counterrevolution and Revolt in Germany.
Yes, thank you very much. We have to consider it. To have this group here and it's Germany, we have winter time right now, and it's summer now in Brazil. Thank you very much for your talk. I want to take the opportunity to announce the Marcuse conference in Frankfurt, which is in next year between October 5th and 8th. The reason is the 100th anniversary of the Institute of Social Research. It's also the conference of the Marcuse Society, which is in Frankfurt, and the call for paper will be out at first of January, and I'm organizing this conference with my colleague Inka. She's here today, and she's listening, and I'm very happy that I have such a good support for organizing this conference. You are invited to come to Frankfurt. It's a January, and it's too close. The call for papers, we have time for till, I guess, June, to the end of June, to send our abstracts to the organizers and prepare your informations, I think, at the end of June. So look at the homepage of the International Marcuse Society, and we will create another one for the conference, and I hope I can join a lot of people here from Brazil, and it would be a good, great honor for me to have a crowd from South America, South. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to announce your conference. Yes, Vladimir, I have one idea when I heard your paper. There is a comic that shows Marcuse and Adorno sitting close to each other, like we today. And Adorno asked Marcuse, how can you be so optimistic if the life and society is so pessimistic? And when I hear your idea of integration, that everything is integrated in Adorno's idea of aesthetics. And so what do you think, would you say, that we have social movements Do you think we have a subculture? Or do you think we have raps? Or do you think we have another kind of cultures going on? So what would Adorno say, or you as an Adorno genius, I guess? So what would you say about Marcuse, against Marcuse? He says, so we needed to make a change to see there are some people who are not integrated. So he was very much more optimistic than Adorno. So just to make a remark. Okay. So I changed my talk a little bit, but it's still very close to Counter-Revolution and Revolt. And I call it, the title is Herbert Marcuse's Dialectic Trap of Change, Lost Promises of a New Time. The German translation of Counter-Revolution and Revolt, written by Herbert Marcuse, the Theorista Critico da Emancipatio, is that right? The Kritiker der kritischen Emanzipation, that was from Hans-Jürgen Krahl, the last assistant from Adorno, who died in Mexico, was published in Germany as a present for Herbert Marcuse's 25th birthday, which is on July 19th. Counter-Revolution and Revolt is remarkable in many aspects. The theorist of the US Revolt, the great refugio, revises some of his postulates from the 60s. That's my opinion. Of course, Marcuse does not profess any loyalty whatsoever to the condemned establishment, to the late capitalist society, but he also never stopped criticizing parts of the left whose advocate he was. In Counter-Revolution and Revolt, he accused the left in the parts of the left in Germany, and I think you can globalize it, of fetishization of the working class. That leads to the use of a mechanical handled vocabulary that disregard any truth of the historical content. That was my reaction against it. Deprived of current tasks, the revolution is characterized as a work of generations. The final crisis of capitalism may very well last longer than this century. And that is against all ideas of a very fast change in a communist society or something. And Marcuse was very more optimistic in the 60s, and he was much more pessimistic in Counter-Revolution because he saw all the faults which the left did, not only in Germany, but I think all over Europe, maybe all over the world. And I would say, really in Brazil, he has not a good idea of what happened in the south, of the global south. He just focused on the European Western countries. That is my opinion. These discouraging, concluding words leave the reader with an uncertain present and a darkly veiled future. Austerity, Marcuse calls radical activism, client and self-destructive. Support in cultural revolution. He sees an anti-intellectualism which it shares in the culture, which it shares with the most reactionary representatives of the establishment. Very interesting. The left intellectualism is compared with the repressive establishment. However, it would be wrong to interpret this punitive judgment only as a polemic against anonymous leftist groups. In reality, one witness of self-criticism, the destruction of thesis that Marcuse had formulated with sharpness during the last years. Certainly, there is no open confession of its kind, a lack that is to be regretted, especially because of the confusion it creates. Only once does the author distance himself from an earlier cultural revolutionary thesis. Meanwhile, the confrontation with his own views is unmistakable in Counter-Revolution. Meanwhile, the confrontation with his own views, Marcuse considers the belief in an immediate revolutionary perspective. practice to be a mistake which he had not always done. Continues to reject the centralist organizational principles of the communists, but now also issues the warning against the fetishization of councils and spontaneity of the working class is not per se progressive. What is significant is no longer any revolutionary activity, which is even disqualified as, quote, idiotic acts of sabotage and destruction, end of quote, but he wrote education. The question he was asked in an interview, but who educates the educator, he never answered. He never answered it, but it seems to me Marcuse thought the critical theory educates the educator. Today, still a lot of so-called self-appointed critical thinkers are sure that this analysis explains contradictions and conflicts all over the world. Also, the historical and political framework of the different societies in the South and North 80 years later are changed. As one can see, the philosopher at one time displays as a revolutionary herald, the messenger who delivers the truth. Political practice still depends on theory. Only the establishment gets along without it, on education, on conviction, on reason. The movement of the establishment, described by Marcuse in this volume as Counterrevolution, which means against something, against the revolt, attempts on the one hand to identify the counter-currents and on the other hand brings up new impulses to redefine revolutionary influences. And here we come close to Adorno. He says in Counter-Revolution and Revolt, art, music, literature, and relations of nature, and that was what Sarah expresses before, the relations of nature and human sensibility now represent for him the spheres of an emancipated society which contain concrete utopian elements against the decline of the revolt. That is a switch in Marcuse's thinking, I guess. The Counter-Revolution had already succeeded to a large extent in reversing the small success of the revolt, and the old forces had re-established the rule. But does Marcuse not go too far when he accuses the society of the West and those along of, quote, practicing the horrors of the Nazi regime and of helping to launch massacre in Indochina, Indonesia, Congo, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Sudan? Is it not a fault to take this criminal acts from communists, mostly from communist countries, and bring it in the same relation to Auschwitz? I think it's a very difficult parallel Marcuse does here. But here it's just an interpretation. With such undifferentiated accusations, does he not fail to recognize the specific differences of mass killings, genocide, the political difference of the time, such as the bloc confrontation or even the internal contradiction of national revolutions or clan authorities who depressed their own people? It seems to me that Marcuse recognizes all these differences in a kind of subcutaneous reflection, but he softens the political acuity of some of his earlier theses from the criticism formulated in Counterrevolution episode. Here we can find a retreat on quiet souls. It is illustrated by an aesthetic theory that Marcuse had professed before his Cultural Revolution interviews. It corresponds to Adorno's views. Art is opposed to all social practice, including revolutionary practice, as an autonomous, highest manifestation of ideas. And I'm very happy that you mentioned Adorno in this, then they come very close. It always transcends its social conditions. Also, art is an illusion. It is precisely in this that it manifests its subversive truths, no means incapable of abolishing the opposition to society. Art itself cannot change reality into practice, nor can it submit to the actual requirements of revolution without denying itself. See it in Art of Revolution. And that was a very a very early discussion between Brecht, Adorno, and Marcuse when they were here in exile in California. Brecht was the guy who was art must be political, and Adorno says, actually, no, art must transcend everything, transcend and give an utopian idea how life could be better. Consequently, Marcuse considers attempts to construct a Marxist aesthetics in which art and society are united to be misguided, since they are different, fundamentally incompatible spheres. This is a basis for radical condemnation of all experiments that pursue the purpose of abolishing the artist's expression. Anti-political happening forms, which Marcuse still regarded with sympathy some time ago when he expressed the hope that their differences in hatred would overthrow the justifying magic of the existing, fall under this convention. Now, this sublimation of art is considered reprehensible. Here one reads the sentence that most clearly expresses the transformation. Quote, "There is no hope translatable into political terms. Art and revolution are not antinomian alone. Art has a higher value than any politics. This does not only apply to current incumbents. Brecht's poems are also preferred to his political pieces. Samuel Beckett is considered the highest example of contemporary art, as with Adorno, he agreed with Adorno. And of Allenberg's Wojciech, it is said that there is more revolution in it than in today's anti-fascist politics." Referring to Marx, Trotsky, and Lenin, Marcuse rejects the concept of a proletarian culture, what he did before. With him, however, this conclusion results from quite different premises. For unlike the aforementioned, he rejects the concept of proletarian revolution altogether. Quote, where proletariat is not revolutionary, revolutionary literature cannot be proletarian literature. I repeat the sentence. Where the proletarian is not revolutionary, revolutionary literature cannot be proletarian literature. End of quote. This is why Marcuse considers, for example, the debate between Brecht and Lukács on Marxist aesthetics to be unproductive today. That is all in this Counterrevolution of the world. And at its core, it is less about aesthetic categories than about the fundamental question of the existence of a revolutionary subject, which was never endowed in the debate of the 30s, but it was endowed in the 60s and 70s. Because, the one-dimensional man, he speaks about the integration of the proletarian in the capitalist system, where is the opposition, and we saw in one-dimensional man the opposition only in the so-called Randgruppen, the groups, the vulnerable groups. Thus, an idealistically turned theory of art, transcending the cultural revolution in phrase, forks a link to earlier groups. Like other representatives of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse insisted that the socialist transformation of society preserve the values of the bourgeois enlightenment. Against the decreed abolition of philosophy, he emphasized the necessity of its realization. In Philosophy and Political Theory, published in 1937, he defended the idealistic philosophy of reason against the accusation that it is mere ideology. It is, quote, precisely not insofar as it is purely idealistic, quote, end of quote. One encounters here a concept that to be present, the idea of human happiness, which is held up not least to communist orthodoxy. Quote, without freedom and happiness in the social relations of men, even the greatest increase in production and the abolition of individual ownership of the means of production still remain bound to the old injustice. Marcuse's thought undoubtedly receives its strongest impulse from solidarity with the humiliated and insulted. The possibility of a changeover from democracy to fascism became the dominant basic motive. The philosophers saw his danger first in the United States, but not only there, for every parliamentary system seems to be at its mercy. The theme is constant. One encounters it, outlasting all corrections. Even in the last writing, which opens with a powerful drumbeat, the Western world continues the atrocities of the Nazi regime. Examples include, I quoted Indochina and all the communist ideologies. Know the reviews that can be found works such as Sun Eclipse by Arthur Koestler or Like a Tear in the Ocean by Max Sperber. Koestler's novel refers to the Stalinist crimes, which were repeatedly denied even by members of the KPD and of the German left. The novel centers on the story of Ernest Rubaschow, who falls into the mills of the Stalinist secret policy for alleged counter-revolutionary crimes. The communist countries of real existing socialism also imprisoned their opposition members as the so-called counter-revolutionaries, or even put them to death, like it was in the Gulag, and one of the most important witnesses is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who described it. Should we add that his examples are not sufficient to illustrate the Western world? Neither then, but even less today. Also, they provide not a little information about the interventions of the great communist powers. It is noteworthy what falls into obligation, that in Pakistan, Biafra, and Sudan, the USSR former, and China took sides on different sides. That Beijing congratulated the Zionist government on the suppression of the Mao's supporters. That it applauded the shooting of Sudanese communists. The invasion of the GSSR, the invasion from Russia into GSSR, Czechoslovakia, remains unmentioned, as does the Middle East conflict. The aspects of communist power politics are omitted because they could shake Marcuse's Manichaean worldview. What is it? Which Manichaean worldview? Manichaean. One would have liked to hear his opinion on the cooperation between radical left-wing groups, especially in Germany, and Arab nationalists like it was in the 70s. It was not until the murders of the Red Army flag in Germany in the 1970s that the entire left-wing capitalism critical spectrum was caught up in the maelstrom of the apparent war of liberation that Marcuse spoke of. The occasion was the storming of the Stockholm embassy on April 24, 1975, by the terrorist group Kommando Olga Mainz, which belongs to the Red Army faction. 2 of the 12 hostages were murdered. Marcuse, I still consider myself a Marxist. Marxism, in the same year, Marxism rejects terror, individual terror, and terror of small groups without mass-based, a revolutionary weapon. Subjectively, it can be assumed that they consider and have considered the action to be a political action. Objectively, this is not the case. When political action leads willfully to the sacrifice of innocent people, that is precisely the point where political action, subjectively, political action turns into a crime. A questionable as a universal message of salvation is the revolutionary project per se. It is not longer the workers who appear as the barriers, but the intellectuals, and, as it was already said in the one-dimensional man, the marginal groups in the society. Marcuse even admits that the conditions and goals of social upheaval, quote, can no longer be adequately expressed in categories of proletarian revolution. Yet he himself falls back again and again into these categories and asserts, quote, Marx's theory remains the guiding principle of practice. But what remains of Marx's theory if it renounces the proletariat as an antithesis of capitalism? But if one assumes that the proletariat no longer exercises a function of a decisive counterpower to capitalism, does not Marx's theory then have to be reviewed? What are its deficits? Can the categories of the theory still explain and guide the way to a free society granted by revolution? Marcuse does not consequently face this question. He wants both to save Marxist theory on the one hand and to revise it on the other. How strong must this revision be today in view of the destruction of nature, climate change, refugee movements, the war in Ukraine, ethnic conflicts, sexualized violence in society? To name only a few crises. Is Marcuse not inconsistent? And despite his criticism of the Soviet system, he wrote this book about the Soviet Union in the 50s, he insisted on its socialist substance. Repeating Trotsky's confusing antinomies, he goes on to interpret the communist states according to the revolutionary scheme of the 20s, that even after Stalin's terror, occupation of the former DDR, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Prague, 1968, Poland, 1989. Certainly, his analysis differed to a large extent also in counter-revolutionary world, from the fetishization and ritualization, which a dogmatical communist socialist-oriented left in Germany still pursued until the 90s. In some groups, until today, I would say parts of Die Linke in Germany still have the same attitude. Marcuse's diagnosis of existing society also seems contradictory. Sometimes tends toward fascism, sometimes not. Sometimes it's integrated everything, sometimes he looks for the subcultural movements and the social movements, and that is what he thinks can lead to a free society. Especially not when the social movements in the metropolis revolt against the misfortunes and pathologies of capitalist power relations. But in the end, it seems never lose. The revolution is announced as well as a counter-revolution. With so much imprecision, definitions were thin. Obviously, Marcuse uses traditional terms to characterize new social phenomena that they are not able to grasp. Let us assume that Marcuse did not find it easy to put them down. But why does he then content himself with unimportant corrections? If the announced upheavals will take place elsewhere, or even extend over the whole century, this means the conquer into indeterminacy. Why does Marcuse always see counter-revolution and revolution at work at the same time? And why do these struggles only take place between the two extremes in the everyday lives of the acting actors? Does he not then obscure the view of processes of change that can be grasped under emancipatory progress? Various NGOs have already emerged as opponents, for example, in European refugee policy, or in the legalization of equality for people with diverse sexual orientations. The question that arises today, 50 years after the publication of the Counterrevolution and Revolt, cannot be posed under the dualism of struggles between equality with a severely structured capitalist society. If the diverse national conflicts come into view, the question arises whether the specific aspects of social struggles are not lost with the claim of totality of an all-encompassing critique. Such a method of reducing different social processes in the world to one formula of counter-revolution versus revolt reminds me a little of the simplifications of the Communist International, which on the whole prove to be wrong and with disparate consequences. Not to rise above that level today certainly cannot be considered excellent. Marcuse undoubtedly made valuable contribution, especially through his interpretation of the world and the transformation of the working class into the metropolis, of the rich north, and of the role of the intellectual. But in the end, the old magic formulas paralyzed. With only a few differentiations, he added up what did not belong together: Mao and the Paris mind, the Che Guevara and the aesthetic, pacifism and terrorism. On curious detours, he arrived again in the pre-show of the year 1970. the promise of the great turn of the world. Once again, the expectation remained unfulfilled. The global revolutionary negation of the existing society does not exist, nor is there a granted goal in world history that would be binding for all. The so-called social fringe groups, the marginalized groups, stand for the social contradiction that once embodied the revolutionary total subject return. They are able to create a disturbance, but not to realize an overthrow, not to realize revolutions. For the time being, this also applies to the intellectuals involved in the institutions. What remains after the curriculum is a disappointing practice. There remains the revolutionary mythical figure, not unlike the promise of a work of art in the revolution. It can also be otherwise, to which Marcuse, active in the Soldiers' Council in 1918, already paid homage. Nevertheless, the attempt is greatness. Marcuse undertook to think the theory of Marxism further, which is essentially different from the ideas and the historical epoch of its founders. His strategy was to try to grasp social conflicts in revolutionary terms of that initial phase. This then included the ever-recurring search for the determination of the revolutionary total subject. Maybe you think still on Lukács' Geschichte und Klassenbewusstsein that the proletarian is the consciousness, the total consciousness for changing the world. Marcuse's times diagnostic critiques, which he formulated from the actions of the revolters and their limitations, are subliminally guided by this revolutionary pathos of an unified revolutionary subject. This has something mythical, something expected, something self-evident. But world history proceeds under real change in completely different social contexts and does not wait until this total subject is constituted or is even constituted under coercive conditions. Once again, this feature proves the impossibility of a universal radical world, political concept that covers all countries and all situations. Marcuse's debut to the seduction of totality. Renouncing differentiations, he added up what did not belong together: fascism and crisis of democracy, now and now. The so-called Marcuse's thinking is characterized by an extreme restlessness. This restlessness is driven by his sensitivity, social injustice, and numerous critical analysis. So his sharp criticism of the Vietnam War is involvement in the civil rights movement. The criticism of the brutal suppression of the revolts in the metropolis of the one-dimensional melancholy or late capitalist society, of the endangerment of democracy developments. He remains in his thoughts and hopes for a free society. Then the critical theorists, whom Alfred Schmidt has called a revolutionary romantic, revolutionärer Romantiker, something of this can be found in the quotation from Versuch über die Befreiung from 1969. Quote, "There is no free society without science, without an inner and other realm of solitude in which individual freedom can unfold. If there is no private life, no independence, no science, no solitude in a socialist society, well, it is not a socialist society. And not yet adds the revolutionary romantic. It was this hope for emancipatory changes through the massive protests in 1968. Counterrevolution and revolt is also the result of this disappointed hope. Arts and nature get a new center of concrete utopia of a free society. Thus, and I come to the end, the 1972 volume remains between revolution and reform, aesthetics and protest, future promises and lost temporary. Between the lines, the white-haired behind his black sunglasses, smoking a Cuba cigar in his left hand, a glass of bourbon in his right, cool smiling old man Herbert looks over the shoulder of the 2 years younger wise Leo as he completely edits Marcuse's script. That is very unknown that Leo Rübenthal worked over the script of Counterrevolution and Revolt. When Marcuse was And the Ku Klux Klan was behind Marcuse. In the 70s, Leopold had a small house outside from Los Angeles, and Marcuse was there because the Ku Klux Klan killed him, and there they worked over this manifest of Counterrevolution. This was Leo Leopold's task, even as Herbert Marcuse was publishing der Zeitschrift für Sozialforschung his early works, such der Kampf gegen den Liberalismus in der totalitären Staatsauffassung von 1934 zum affirmativen Charakter der Kultur or Philosophy and Critical Theory aus 1993. Also, some article of the 1972 book have to be listed: dominance of neoliberalism, capitalist exploitation, which shifted in its inhuman consequences much more to the campus of the global south, but shows two more power creating laws, or like the writer Ilya Troyanov calls his new proletariat in the capitalistic countries the superfluous human. Doesn't speak for proletariat, he says it's superfluous human. We have people in the society which are not able to get integrated in society. They are just, and that is an expression from Ilya Troyanov. Further, it is for sure that now, much more than 50 years ago, the destruction of nature or of the human resources and the misregarding of the relevance of human rights as universal principles, which have been enforced as a slogan of the Iranian Revolution, San Sendeci Asari, Mujer, Vida, Libertad, Woman, Life, Freedom, Frauen, Leben, Freiheit, and which will be right now almost totally ignored as a Russian military aggression against the Ukrainian people. Human rights have to be defended by the new concept of emancipatory political actions. Thank you very much.
Obrigada, Peter. And now we will hear Silvio. We didn't change the title of this Dialectics of Violence and Experiences of Politics.
I have principles. So thank you for everyone to come here. It will be a pleasure to have you our guests in Atula. And it's almost the end of the project that we had with Surti, Sunny, Carlos, Alejandro, and Nadia. Surti. So I will try to make a kind of relation between the project we have since 2018, and part of this project is to discuss the dialectics of violence, inspired by this debate and Marcuse's thoughts on this topic. So we, in the last year, we have a lecture I shared with my friend out in UFBC, Alexa Bretas, who is coming next day. And the topic was violence, and we could read a lot of books, texts in the science on violence. That was a very interesting movement that we do the last months, some months ago, with the students here. So, but for me, I will try to make this connection, and inspired by a provocation that Carlos gave us someday, we had to psychoanalyze the critical theory. And that words makes me think a lot what it means or what we can do with this. And when I read for this conference the Counterrevolution and Revolt, I read with this glasses, with this psychoanalytical view. So the Extimacies maybe it will be an interesting point to think about this question. And I believe that in one way or other, we are connected because we talk about we talk about aesthetics as an important movement. So I will try to make you to think about the dialectics of violence, what it means. The second part would be a kind of connection with contemporary reading by Etienne Balibar, lectures on violence and politics, and then I will try to return to Counterrevolution and Revolt. Let me just take the time to break it. So the first part of this perspective is what is this dialectics of violence? I follow a sentence quotation by another essay, Marcuse's essay, called "The Problem of the Violence and the Radical Opposition," wrote in 1967. And he followed. He said the following: I think that the concept of violence covers two different forms: the institutionalized violence of the establishment system and the violence of resistance, which is necessarily illegal in relation to positive law. It is meaningless to speak of the legality of resistance. No social system, even the freest, can constitutionally legalize violence directed against itself. That's a very interesting point, how the system would be against itself. Each of these forms has functions that conflict with those of the other. There is violence of suppression and violence of liberation. There is violence for the defense of life and violence of aggression. And both forms have been and will remain historical forms. I would like to remark this historical force, because sometimes we read Marcuse as a defensor of violence and spontaneous violence and so on, but we need to think about this historical context, where the violence happened. Violence presents a broad spectrum, and therefore the need to submit its historical forms to the exercise of criticism is a fundamental task. It is not just a matter of measuring the degree of violence, if it's better or worse, present in each historical act. From the historical point of view, as Marcuse reminds us, there is no way to measure violence, because it's not determined by an abstract norm. And I believe that's something Vladimir taught in this. The critique of violence is organized by the analysis of the historical tendencies contained in violent acts. Where does the violent act tend toward? Liberation or suppression? What does the violent action defend? Life or aggression? Put this way, the critical exercise seems simple, but we know it's not. Diagnosis is not limited to an identification of who promotes the violent act. Of course, knowing who is responsible for the violent action has helped us to better understand the historical trend of a certain historically located violence. It's important to recognize that a certain massacre was an order determined by such or such force of the state, or that a certain riot results from a certain unsatisfied population. But knowing this is like recognizing the figures that are in the photography of the event, just as Paulo, without understanding the whole film. Understanding this moving images is a good way to understand violence. Its rupture is so great that recognizing its starting point only allows us to operate the diagnosis of its initial subjects, the state policy, a colonizing population, what is this? However, Marcuse would affirm it is up to the critical exercise to pursue the tendencies that erupt from this action, the transformation, this action for transformation. Where is it? Certainly, we have here the need to be suspicious of violent actions, ever libertarian ones, without disqualifying or diminishing them. Examining violent action by the critical balance avoids both or blind passion for a certain side of the front and the exaggerated skepticism that makes each and every violent act part of the same picture of a society that never changes. By the way, we would like to say that violence is a concept in motion. As a consequence, we express this dynamic idea as a border concept, as Freudian psychoanalysis would term many of its operations. As a border, it is a concept that lies in the in-between of the elements in relation, something that makes it an operational conception in which extremes pass through each other. Then I will try to be here present the Lacanian concept of extimacy that presents this space of transitoriness. Thus, what we intend is to think the concept of violence in its in-between of the two extreme things. That is, violence of liberation and violence of domination are not shown as two separate poles founded on historical grounds different from each other. These two tendencies appear within a historical ground permitted by conflicts. They coexist as lines that mark each other, as possibilities that are sometimes distant from each other, sometimes close to each other. Thus, violence shows itself in the terrain of dialectics. The concept of extimacy is crucial for understanding the boundaries of such relations. These two extremes, inner and out, contact each other through a short circuit, encapsulated by Rimbaud's formula, I is another, G is another. However, we should avoid a naive understanding of such a connection, as Lacan reminds us in his second seminar. If we interpret this motto as an equivalent identity, I equal another, the extimate value will be worthless. Extimacy differs from the juxtaposition of the I as another, or vice versa. Here, Lacan warns against a meaningless dialectics of abstract equivalence between I and the other. The immediate reflection of I and the other includes everything. It's another way to say nothing about nothing. According to Lacan, such a general abstraction can be avoided by focusing on the means that mediates the other and the I. That is, extimacy does not absolutize either one of the two parts of this relationship. Neither the other nor the I are isolated parts of a relationship. On the contrary, extimacy arises when corresponding elements emerge as elements structured by the boundaries of the relations between the other and the I. So, let us try to conceive the dialect of violence as a border relation. This place that makes doubtful the boundaries between the domains of freedom and domination. Something for which we can return to the central concerns of German ideology, when the French Revolution became the object of critical reflection on the changes that inhabited it. The enigma by which the practices of liberation deviate into a policy of terror. To return to this point means, therefore, to operate an analysis of violence from its extremity, from the frontier between the violence that is exercised for liberation and its opposite, the terror that subjects to the object conditions of domination. So that's interesting to note the perspective of counter-revolution and revolt as a critique, as certainly Peter said, of the New Left movement. How many times he is criticizing the New Left movement at that time. The historical context of that time differs from the end of the 60s, as Peter said too. Marcuse follows the protests of New Left, civil rights movements, anti-war movement, and so on and so on. However, he notes the obsolescence of these movements as part of the so-called New Left. As his note, it's the changing of it. The problem is not New Left and its plurality of views, this intersection of the New Left, but how New Left can face the historical change promoted by Counterrevolution. Because the distinction here in 62 is the presence of a permanent Counterrevolution. And the New Left for Marcuse at that time has to change the way of thinking because permanent Counterrevolution changes the context, the historical context of this movement. So how we can think about the violence, how we can think about the New Left in that time. 3 points for a critique of New Left in Marcuse's period. First one is that one that Peter-Erwin said for us, this kind of fetishism of the working class. That's very interesting perspective because New Left needs to change the language about the working class. He said about the isolation of the New Left in these terms, that he's spoken just for the people that understand their own grammatics, but not for the new working class or new organization, economic organization of that time. The other part is the new material basis of the civilization. It is a consequence of the perception of Marcuse that appears since a one-dimensional. The technocracy will sustain an even more integrated society, a one-dimensional society. But that's an interesting perspective for Marcuse in the Counterrevolution and Revolt. Because he said something that's very interesting and it sometimes appears when we think about the New Left as an isolated movement. But in this quotation I will read here, it's interesting to note how Marcuse will think about it. The isolation, I quote, the isolation of the New Left is thus well-founded. Far from testifying to the movement's lack of social roots, this isolations correspond to the actual historical situation. It projects indeed the finite negation of the entire culture of monopoly capitalism at its most advanced stage. And I believe that is corresponding with Vladimir's perspective on aesthetics. This isolation reflects the unprecedented and unorthodox qualities of the revolution, the radical contradiction to the established culture. Allergic to its factual separation from the masses, not ready to admit that it is expressive of the social structure of advanced capitalism, that is a mass culture, and that its separated character can be overcome only in the long struggle to change this structure. The movement displays inferiority, complexity, defeatism, or apathy. That's very interesting because in this criticism of Marcuse's criticism, he's pointing a kind of defeatism of the melancholy of the left, maybe in front of the force of the permanent Counterrevolution. But it's the same time, this isolation of the New Left is interesting for Marcuse because it's far from the integration of the one-dimensional society. So, that's an important point here. How? So we can change, we can think better about this kind of relation and the use of the violence by the New Left or this discussion about the New Left and violence. I will jump a little to take more time with you. And here I remember a problem that Tim Balibar put for us in a recent book, a relatively recent book, Violence and Violence and Civility: The Limits of Political Philosophy. That's a very interesting lecture, or that Balibar gave some years ago, and he thinks about the problem that violence is almost a kind of anti-politics. But what the Balibar is putting in this it's trying to think in this is how politics is trying to think it's determined by violence, especially the extreme violence. And when politics is created by as an effort to avoid the violence, the extreme violence, that's a kind of dialect of Slater and Jansen here, because violence can determine the limits of the politics and so on and so on. So that's interesting because Balibar is thinking how we can how we can escape from this kind of master-slave dialects of master and slave, because he's thinking what is the kind of negation of the politics able to avoid the return of violence. He thinks in three perspectives. The first one, two of them is bad answer for this problem. The first one is non-violence. It's very strange for us because he's thinking violence, and the first thing that we think about to avoid the violence is non-violence. But what Balibar is thinking here is it's a kind of abstraction of the violence, as we can create a space without violence, and that's the danger of this exit, or politics exit. In second way, in the way we are determining non-violence as the principle of our action, our political action, we are saying that violence can determine politics in certain way. So we have to avoid this violence all the time as a devil that we need to avoid. On the other way, maybe sometimes Marcuse is very close to this. He thinks the problem of the counter-violence as another problem. Because counter-violence is a kind of absorption of the violence of the for the politics to create a new horizon of politics. So, for example, we can think about the Red Army or other terrorists' way to think an answer against the politics. And the problem is here how we can avoid this changing of the politics as a violence, as an extreme violence. So Balibar thinks this problem in the counter-violence as a non-integration, as a defeated or as a deficit of the politics against this kind of extreme violence. So what has rest for us, maybe? The last answer Balibar is trying to shout to us, and I will try to think with you about this problem, is civility. It's another word for to think about this possibility of the politics. Civility is a way to think politics as a politics, not as a part of the violence, and not as a non-violence or anti-violence. As an anti-violence for sure, because politics is thinking by its own autonomous way, and that's very interesting because civility is a kind of ethics sometimes very close to Machiavelli's thoughts, as a kind of creation of networks of politics, and sometimes, but that the interesting point for Extimacies and the lecture gave us is full of examples of this kind of praxis. The way of solidarities against the war, the way of networks we can create, and that's very interesting to note how Balibar is thinking about. So that's interesting perspective because Balibar is thinking about the praxis of the politics, and when he thinks about the praxis of the politics, he's thinking about the way how violence is a praxis too. Let me think one more words about this. The two ways Balibar is thinking about the return of the violence is a kind of hyper-objectivation of violence, one part. The hyper-objectivation of the violence is, we can think about the reification as a way of violence, how we can reify the bodies, how we can reify the ghettos and so on and so on, the workers and so on and so on. The objectivation and how violence can return by this kind of objectivation of this relation. And on the other way, the hyper-subjectivation is a way to think about this this reproduction, the reproduction of the violence. And in a certain way, a kind of we talk about it in the last section with Rose, a kind of a narcissistic way to think about the indifference against the world, a kind of and the other as an enemy we can have to fight and exterminate all the time. So this kind of relation between objectification and subjectification is a way to return to reproducing violence for Vladimir. Civility is a way to think how we can cut this process, because sometimes hyper-objectification, reification, for example, can turn us into a subjectification. And the other side is the same. Subjectivation can turn into objectification too. But if we think about how subjectification turns into objectivation, we can break this process like a kind of. It's interesting because there is an image that Balibar creates for it as a kind of movement that way. Objectivation and the hyper-objectivation are returning to ourselves. Huh? Yeah, but for Balibar, we can cut this movement. And we need to think about praxis about it. It's a little abstract, I believe. I don't know if the images can help you about this, but if we return to Marcuse's Counterrevolution and think about the potentials of art in this way, it's very interesting to note how it could work. It's interesting because Marcuse structured her books about this kind of passages that is not so evident. One of the chapters that Sarah told about it in some part is nature and revolution. What's the relation between nature and revolution? How we can connect this? And the other part is art and revolution. That's a little obvious because there are a lot of literature about this. But it's interesting the way that Marcuse is trying to think about this art and revolution. It's a way to create an image of the changing society. I believe yesterday we had a part of the discussion about this, how we can create a kind of symbolic field for transforming society, as Nadia said to us. And that's an interesting part. Marcuse knows that and I'm going to the end of this discussion. Marcuse knows about the difficulties of this perspective because Marcuse said, we are in the counter-revolutionary times. And the counter-revolutionary times for Marcuse, in terms of arts, mean to break the aesthetic forms, the mode that aesthetics can create order, create a language, create us, and in that we have a lot of connections with Marcuse, no, Vladimir. But what I would like to say is, Marcuse is trying, and Counter-Revolutionary and Revolt is a kind of, not a theoretical book, but a praxis book, a kind of manual to survive in counter-revolutionary times. And that's interesting because he is connecting every fragment of this work, every part of this every part that is destroyed by the counter-revolutionary perspective, to try to recuperate a possibility to change. Freud said about the education for reality, and I believe that's in the way. Of course, that's not to educate your son or daughter how the world works, but how difficult it is to live and how we can create a praxis to live with these difficulties. I believe that's a good point of me. And that's the point for me. I will finish with this quote. Sorry. Here. That's an interesting perspective that Marcuse has present about the possibility to change. Sorry, because I will not quote, so we can. I will paraphrase. The perspective is in this praxis we need to think about some difficulties we have in permanent counter-revolution, because the difficulty is counter-revolutionary here is a kind of one-dimensional perspective that everything is integrated with everything, like a machine. There is a piece here that has produced us in relation to another piece. So, but that's interesting because a revolution or the revolt here is a kind of small piece that doesn't work, a small dysfunction of this. And art and nature are very exemplary perspectives for that, because we can live in a pandemic and we think about this a lot, but a single proclaim, a single doubt about the life we are living is a dangerous for this integrated character. That's interesting how it can change all the things. If you think about the Black Lives Matter, we can think about this. George Floyd was not a revolutionary. He was arrested by policy, like many black people there. Then, but when he said, "I can breathe," this phrase became a kind of motto, political motto, and it made the machine a dysfunction inside the machine. That's a way to think civility too, or think Marcuse as close as Extimacies could be. But that's a perspective, how we can think about our praxis. And when I think about work of art by Marcuse and Way, I was thinking about this, the praxis that work of art allows us to do. So I'm the end, but I would like to quote the final phrase here that I love from Marcuse. Because the connection between politics and art is not a kind of politics of art or art politics, but Marcuse said something like that. This kind of relation between art and politics is the architecture for a free society. We discuss a lot about this in Mexico, and that's interesting because Marcuse is taking an architecture that's a small art in Hegelian system, and takes it as a perspective of changing. And architecture is a way to think that our bodies, our living in a more connected way. That's interesting to think. So I don't know. That's I don't know if I can talk more about the Extimacies, but it's trying to make a relation between our project and this excellent book that he has 50 years old.
A gente tem um pouquinho de tempo, se alguém quiser fazer comentários, qualquer uma das apresentações.
Bom, será que alguém tem algum comentário? Não?
So, something that interests me in Marcuse studies is about art and aesthetics. It is primacy, maybe of beauty, beautiful art as the beauty as the subversive potential of art, and I question if it's possible an art that is not purely beautiful, but art that passes through ugliness, and it's maybe revolutionary too. And that links with other questions about love and hate. If it is possible to love it without hate, or if there is some subversive potential in hate with love too. Thinking about other questions that emerged with the other communications, and linking with what Silvio said about non-violence, if it's possible a pure non-violence position in a ultra-violent times. I'm trying to tensionate these polarities and to provocate and hear what you all have to talk about these issues, these problems. No, I don't have a specific person to ask these problems, but I would like to hear you all, including the mediator, the
Thing specific.
We decided that.
Okay, so I was thinking about the ugly art, of course. We won't, it's here to say something about that. But I was thinking about the art and street art, for example, something that is kind of art. Not but maybe that's the connection that feels about this. Like a kind of use the garbage to make a kind of silent. Maybe that's interesting because it's a way to recover some kind of garbage of capitalism, to put in our faces how capitalism is apocalyptic. So that's the interesting question to think about. Maybe Marcuse is not so prepared to answer it, because sometimes Marcuse is very German. Maybe sorry, but to think. But the point is not the
Who's responsible? I have many criticisms about this text because I would insist, well, maybe in the political perspective, violence is absolutely indifferent. For example, we could not advocate non-violence as an abstract position. Because this is absolutely ineffective. What you could say about the violence in the Haitian revolution? We could think Haitian revolution without violence, or without extreme violence, or real extreme violence. A violence of devastation of nature, devastation of property, devastation of persons. Well, but this was the only way to get the independence and to stop this slavery. Then we accepted that, the most extreme violence. But I ask if violence is just a question of evaluation of context. There is some context that you can use because you know that it will be fruitful, and there is some situation that you know that you cannot use because there will be a state violence that's much more strong than you. Then, if this is the case, I would advocate for the fact that violence is not.
We are connecting politics and violence. Because maybe it's a philosophy of praxis in this way, not an intellectual way to think the violence. Let's hear something that Marcuse sometimes say, I don't know, I cannot speak about the action of these students because they are trying to do something. We can criticize, we can dialogue with them, but that's a historical context that we need to analyze. So maybe in this way, that's I was insisting in this point. The point here is the praxis of this how this concept or how this idea, can mobilize a kind of praxis. For example, violence is a praxis, a historical praxis, and politics too.
Yeah, but what do you understand by violence?
Structural violence.
When you speak violence, what do you understand?
I don't think about Vladimir perspective of extreme violence, something that broke the rules or reorganized the rules too, and that's the point for me. Violence is a kind of space out of the limits of the poets, but the poets always thinking about violence all the time. So, of course, when we think about a war in a certain way, that's the good example. We cannot speak about violence without the image, the historical images of the violence. It's difficult to think about an idea about this. But that's a kind of organization that avoids maybe certain kinds of politics for life,
But you see, for example, when you try definition, you try negative one. Huh? You said what is violence? Violence is what politics is not. What is uncooperative. It's complicated. But then you say no. But war, for example, is the example of violence. But who defines what is war? Because we could say, well, but we live in a civil war. This is a possibility, analytical possibility. Say, our normal political structure is a civil war. Then the distinction between war and politics is not really clear.
So what do you say about the real war? Because it's Ukraine and Russia.
Well, I would say okay, but there is no distinction between a real war, let's say a war that you see tanks, you see bombs, you see things like that.
No, we see that people are dying because another country is takes another country and wants to destroy it, and want to kill people, and want to get the domination about it.
And how to describe, for example, a situation that people are dying because the police is entering their areas and they are killing everybody. It's not a war.
What?
Yeah, but it's not a war between the states. But the question is,
but you have to define it. Is it a war? What kind of violence is a war? What kind of violence is it?
But why don't you define?
Because you have the reality in the world. You have the reality of an aggression that one system takes over another system, kills people, extermination. You have to explain what does it mean.
But you see, then we are obliged to assess, well, the normal example of war is a war against the states. Because the Russia-Ukraine is easy to define because, okay, there is two states, one state invaded another one. But actually, when we try to make a distinction between politics and war, you presuppose more than that. You presuppose more than this normal distinction, the normal question between there is state sovereignty and the state sovereignty wasn't respected. But I think that, well, then if you want to make a distinction between politics and war, this will be much more complicated.
I understand that, but you ask me to define violence. I ask you to define violence. You say I can't define violence.
No, I would say that
What is violence for you? What is violence for you? I mean, I give you this question back. What is violence for you?
violence for reason of concept.
But it happened. It's real. People kill people. There is an aggression against them.
Yeah,
violence is
but you see, we use the extreme situations, but you don't use violence just in the situation. If you say, okay, violence is when someone kills someone, huh? Okay, then we have a very specific
Yeah.
This reminds me of the dialogue between Wittgenstein and Karl Popper that ended up with a poker.
Okay, I have a pair and three, so maybe it's three. I have three.
But that's interesting how many words we talk about violence if it's not a known concept. Because we are talking about this. That's interesting perspective. And known concept is a way to think more about this situation, this story. But okay.
Who won? Wittgenstein or Popper?
I'm with Vinoba.
E a gente termina por aqui, depois em 15 minutos a gente volta para onde o professor fala. If he didn't change the title, it is narrative identity and Counterrevolution. Thank you.